In this video, I'm going to demonstrate and explain the use of namespaces. I've tried to make namespaces harder than they really were, but over time I realized that really they're not that hard. In their most basic form, they're basically just a way of organizing your classes. They help you to avoid any naming conflicts that might come about when you have two assemblies that basically have contained within them the same class name, and you need to refer to both of them within your application. So it's a way of qualifying those class names by appending on a qualifier to the beginning, and you can make it anything you want it to be. Back in your VB6 days, if you think back, if you were previously a Visual Basic programmer before VisualBasic.net, you might remember that two different components couldn't have the same prog ID. In other words, you couldn't have component X with both two components called X, both of the class RunMe. Because if you did, then the prog IDs were the same, and since they're global to the entire computer, you'd run into the situation where your application didn't know which one to load in, and so that was usually something referred to as DLL hell, where you had some versioning problems. Well, namespaces help you to avoid that situation. Just some quick tips about namespaces. Every bit of code that you write within Visual Basic is in a namespace. Even if you don't declare a namespace with a namespace keyword, you'll note that there's still a root namespace that you can set within the project properties, and we're going to show you how to do that in just a moment. Also, assemblies can have multiple namespaces, and namespaces can be represented in multiple assemblies. And we're going to show an example of that in just a moment. You're going to have two different assemblies that both belong to the same namespace. Because ultimately, namespaces can be used, again, to organize your classes and make sense out of your classes. And they can be multi-level. So here's a good example. You could have like your company name dot department dot application dot class name. And so it becomes very clear who this belongs to and what it does and what application that it's used for and so forth. And you within your own organization can adopt these kind of naming conventions so that any assemblies that are created can be identified to who owns them and who's responsible for them and what application and what are they doing and so forth. So without anything further, what we're going to do is create a couple of class libraries to begin, and then we're going to create a Windows application that will actually use both of those class libraries. So very quickly, what we're going to do is create a class library, and first one we're going to call is book, and we're going to change the name of the class to book, and book is going to have a couple of public fields like the ISBN, and whoops, I messed that up. Public title string and public author string. Great. Okay, and we just want to make this real simple for purposes of illustration. Now, I might ask you, what is the namespace for this? And you might say, well, there is no namespace. We don't have the namespace word. So I'd say, okay, well, you want me to put the namespace keyword in? Let's put that in for a second. We're going to call this Big Brain Books, and we'll put an end namespace. Okay, and you might say, well, that's better. Now, the way you refer to this component is Big Brain Books.book. And I would tell you that that's not quite correct. The actual namespace would be book.bigbrainbooks.book. Now, why would that be? Why did I append on an additional qualifier? Well, the reason is because each project, when you create it, has a default root namespace that's associated with the project's name. So we named our project book, and therefore, it by default will create the root namespace as book. Any additional namespaces that we add on will just be appended on the qualifier before our actual name of our class, which is the last book. Hope that makes sense. What we'll do right now is we'll get rid of this namespace statement, and instead what we'll do is change the root namespace in the project properties by right-clicking on book and selecting properties from the pop-up menu. Our book project property pages pop up. And what we're interested in is the root namespace. And so what we're going to do is change that to Big Brain Books, which is the name of our fictitious company. Select Apply, and we'll hit Save, and then we're going to hit Build Solution. And we have succeeded. And so the next thing that we're going to do is create another assembly, another class library for us. And so what we're going to do is create new project, Visual Basic Projects, class library, and we're going to call this CD. So our bookstore is going to sell both books and CDs. Select OK. In just a moment, we'll see our new class library template appear. We're going to call the class CD, and we'll have public CD ID string. Public artist string, and public title string. So the next thing that we're going to do then is set our CD property page root namespace to Big Brain Books. Now you say, well, why did you do that? Don't we want a different name? Well, not for this example. We want to demonstrate that you can have the same namespace in different assemblies and still use them within the same application. And I think that that's a pretty important distinction to make just from the outset. So we go hit OK. We're going to save everything, and then we're going to build it. And everything looked great. So now what we're going to do is create our Windows application. We'll go to File, New Project, Visual Basic Projects, Windows Application. We're going to call this Bookstore, and select OK. And so in just a moment, our form designer appears, and we're going to plop out the obligatory button 1. But the first thing that I really need to do is create a reference to both of the assemblies that I just created. And to do that, I'm going to right-click on the bookstore and select Add Reference. It pops open the Add Reference dialog. We're going to browse to the DLLs that we created just a moment ago. So the first one was book. We'll look in the bin directory and find the book.dll. Great. And you'll note that it showed up down here under selected components. And we'll do the same thing for the CD. So we're going to go up to CD, bin, cd.dll, select open, and it too shows up in our selected components, so we can select multiples. And then hit OK. And in just a moment, you'll see over here that we have references to both book and CD. So I want to look at the code behind for this Windows form. And first thing that I want to do is talk about direct addressing. When we create an instance of, let's say, for example, our book, let's call it My Book, as we can type in book, but it's not there. What we'll have to type in is Big Brain Books dot. Now notice when I do this, I type in the namespace, Big Brain Books, and both book and CD, even though they're from separate assemblies, they both appear in our pop-up window. This is great. That means we did it right. So we're going to select book equals new Big Brain Books dot book. Now, if we had a really long namespace like Big Brain Books dot whatever department dot whatever row dot whatever this whatever that dot book, well, that can be kind of cumbersome typing it after a while. So instead of the direct addressing method, which basically means that we type out the entire qualified namespace and the class name, we're going to take a different approach and use the import statement. The import statement allows us to kind of do a shortcut where we're able to just type imports, Big Brain Books, and then we'll show with CD here, with my CD as CD. And it shows up without having to type in the fully qualified namespace because we said we imported that. So we could also type in book here if we wanted to, and notice that it now shows up within our drop-down list box, indicating that now we have access to that as well. So we can take either one of those approaches, but this is kind of a shortcut method and kind of a good convention, as if you don't like to type like I do. So let's recap what we've done up to this point. First of all, we created 2 assemblies. Each of the assemblies both had Big Brain Books as the namespace. We talked about how to create additional namespace qualifiers if we wanted to, but we chose not to in this case. And then we made references to both of those assemblies within our application, and we showed how to directly access the namespace as we typed bigbrainbooks.book, and we had to type that a lot throughout our application. It'd be very burdensome. So instead, we chose to use the import statement, Big Brain Books, and then all we had to do is just refer to book or CD whenever we need to create a new instance of either of those classes. So what we need to do now is show how kind of the opposite is true, where if we were to create another namespace with the same class name of book, how that would impact our application. So let's do that right now. So I'm going to save what we have and come back to it in just a moment. And what we'll do is create a new project, class library. We're going to call this import books. So this might be some type of affiliate or just a different type of book that we have available within our store. But we're going to name it book. We're going to leave the namespace the way it is. We're not going to touch the root namespace that was set by default by the application, but we are going to add some public fields, public ISBN, a string, and then we're going to have public author, a string, and then public title, a string, and then we'll have an additional field we'll call country, a string. Great. So now let us save that and compile it, and then go back into our bookstore application. Let's just select Open Project, and we'll get back into our bookstore. And now what we'll do is we'll create a reference to our new component that we just created. We'll go to Import Books, bin Import Books, and select OK. Now, when we do this, notice that we can reference it as, well, first of all, let me do this. Let's get rid of our reference now to the book. Let's create a new one. My book as book equals new book. Okay. So now let's go ahead and make another my import book as, and then we'll type in import books dot book equals to new import books dot book. And as you notice, there's no problems. We don't get any negative feedback from Visual Basics designer here, so we're probably in good shape. Now what if I were to use the import statement on import books? And then, well, notice what happened here. We get a squiggly line under book that says book is ambiguous, imported from the namespace or types import books and Big Brain Books. As it scrolls off to the right-hand side of the screen, you can't see it. So basically what that's saying is that since we've imported 2 namespaces, and both of those namespaces have a class in them called book, we've got a problem because we have some ambiguity. So we don't know which type of book that we're trying to create here. And so that's a problem. There's no ambiguity here because we've qualified it with the import books namespace qualifier. So this helps us to avoid those situations. We have to be completely unambiguous. If we're going to choose to do this, we probably just would not use either one or both of the import statements here. But I hope that makes it a little more obvious what namespaces are used for and why they're important and how you can get out of some of these conflicts by just manipulating the namespace within your classes that you create. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you.